So in this video, I'm going to show you some basic Docker commands. At the beginning, I'm going to explain what the difference between container and image is, because that's something a lot of people confuse. Then very quickly go through version and tag, and then show you a demo of how to use the basic Docker commands. Commands that will be enough to pull an image locally, to start a container, to configure a container, and even debug the container. So with that said, let's get started. So what is the difference between container and image? Mostly people use those terms interchangeably, but actually there is a fine difference between the two. To see theoretically, container is just a part of a container runtime. So container is the running environment for an image. So as you see in this graphic, the application image that runs the application, it could be Postgres, Redis, some other application, needs, let's say, a file system where it can save the log files or where it can store some configuration files. It also needs some environmental configuration like environmental variables and so on. So all of this environmental stuff are provided by a container. And container also has a port that is binded to it, which makes it possible to talk to the application which is running inside of a container. And of course, it should be noted here that the file system is virtual in the container. So the container has its own abstraction of an operating system, including the file system and the environment, which is of course different from the file system and environment of the host machine. So in order to see the difference between container and image in action, let's head over to the Docker Hub and find, for example, a Redis image. Another thing is that Docker Hub, all the artifacts that are in the Docker Hub are images. So we're not talking about containers here. All of these things are images, Docker official image. So we're going to go ahead and pull a Redis image out of the Docker Hub to my laptop. So you see the different layers of the image are downloaded. So once the download is complete, I can check all the existing images on my laptop using Docker images command. So I see I have Redis and Postgres with tags, image IDs, and so on. Another important aspect of images is that they have tags or versions. So for example, if we go back to the Docker Hub, each image that you look up in the Docker Hub will have many different versions. The latest is always the one that you get when you don't specify the version, of course. If you have a dependency on a specific version, you can actually choose the version you want and specify it. You can select one from here. So this is what you see here. The tag is basically the version of the image. So I just downloaded the latest, and I can also see the size of the image. So now to this point, we have only worked with images. There is no container involved and there is no Redis running. So now if, let's say I need Redis running so that my application can connect to it, I'll have to create a container of that Redis image that will make it possible to connect to the Redis application. And I can do it by running the Redis image. So if I say docker run Redis, this will actually start the image in a container. So as I said before, container is a running environment of an image. So now if I open a new tab and do docker ps, I will get status of all the running Docker containers. So I can see the container Redis is running with a container ID based on the image of Redis and some other information about it. For example, the port that it's running on and so on. So as you see here, the docker run Redis command will start the Redis container in the terminal in an attached mode. So for example, if I were to terminate this with the Control C, you see that Redis application stops and the container will be stopped as well. So if I do docker ps again, I see that no container is running. So there is an option for Docker run command that makes it possible to run the container in a detached mode, and that is -d. So if I do docker run -d Redis, I will just get the ID of the container as an output, and the container will stop running. So if we check again docker ps, I see the container with the ID, which is the same thing here, is running. So this is how you can start it in the detached mode. Now, for example, if you would want to restart a container because, I don't know, some application crashed inside or some error happened, so you want to restart it, you would need the container ID. So just the first part of it, not the whole string. And you can simply say docker stop ID of the container, and that will stop the Docker container. Nothing running. If you want to start it again, you can use the same ID to start again. So let's say you stop Docker container. At the end of the day, you go home, you come back the next day, open your laptop, and you want to restart the stopped container, right? So if you do docker ps, there's the output is empty, you don't see any containers. So what you can do, alternative to just looking up your history, command line history, is you can do docker ps -a, which will show you all the containers which are running or not running. So here you see the container ID again, and you can restart it. Okay, so let's try another thing. Let's say you have two parallel applications that both use Redis, but in different versions. So you would need two Redis containers with different image versions running on your laptop, right? At different times maybe, or at the same time. So if we go back here, we have the latest version of Redis running. And let's head over to the Docker Hub and look for a slightly older version, like this one here. So remember the first time that we downloaded the Redis image, we did docker pull Redis. However, if you use docker run with Redis, followed by the version number, it will pull the image and start the container right away. So it does two commands in one. So it's docker pull, then docker start in one command. So if I do this, it says it can't find the image locally. So it goes and pulls the image from the repository to my laptop. And again, we see some layers are downloaded and the container is started right away. And now if I do docker ps, you see that I have two Redises running. So this is where it gets interesting. Now, how do you actually use any container that you just started? So in this output, you also see the ports section, which specifies on which port the container is listening to the incoming requests. So both containers open the same port, which is what was specified in the image. So in the logs of the container, you can see the information, running mode, standalone, port 6379. So how does that actually work? And how do we not have conflicts while both are running on the same port? So to explain that, let's head over to our slide and see how this works. As you know, container is just a virtual environment running on your host. And you can have multiple containers running simultaneously on your host, which is your laptop, PC, whatever you're working on. And your laptop has certain ports available that you can open for certain applications. So how it works is that you need to create a so-called binding between a port that your laptop, your host machine has, and the container. So for example, in the first container part here, you see container is listening on port 5000, and you bind your laptop's port 5000 to that containers. Now, you will have conflict if you open two 5000 ports on your host, because you will get a message, the port is already bound or is already in use. You can't do that. However, you can have two containers, as you see in the second and third containers are both listening on port 3000, which is absolutely okay as long as you bind them to two different ports from your host machine. So once the port binding between the host and the container is already done, you can actually connect to the running container using the port of the host. So in this example URI, you would have some app, localhost, and then the port of the host. And the host then will know how to forward the request to the container using the port binding. So if we head back, here you see that containers have their ports and they're both running on the same one. However, we haven't made any binding between my laptop's port and the container port. And because of that, the container is basically unreachable by any application, so I won't be able to use it. So the way we actually do that is by specifying the binding of the ports during the run command. So I'm gonna break this and check that there is just one container running now. I'm gonna stop the other one as well so we can start them anew. Okay, so we see both containers are here. So now we want to start them using the binding between the host and the container ports. But again, we have two Redises, so we need to bind them to two different ports on my laptop. So the way to do it is you do docker run and you specify with -p the port of the host. That's the first one. So let's go with 6000. It doesn't really matter in this case. And the second one is the port that you're binding this to, which is the container port. So we know the container port will be 6379, and this is where we bind my laptop's port 6002. And if I do this, I forgot Redis here. So, and now if I do docker ps, let's actually clean this, docker ps again. Here you see the binding here, right? So your laptop's 6000 port is bound to the containers 6379. So now let's do another thing and let's start it in a detached mode. So like this. Let's check again. It's running again. And now I want to start the second container. So here you see it created a bunch of containers because when I specified different options with the port binding, it actually created new containers. That's why you see a couple of more here. So I'm going to copy the image name with the tag 6.2 -p. So for example, if I were to do this now, and I would try to run the other Redis, the second Redis container with the same port on my laptop, I would get an error saying port is already allocated. So I can do 6001 and run it. Again, I'll run it in detached mode so that I don't see port. And if I go over here and say docker ps, I see that I have two different Redis versions running, both of them bound to different ports on my laptop, and the containers themselves listening to requests on the same port.